Good morning, everyone. We have such a great education committee, and we had a program a little early, but thank you. We had a program organized for this Sunday, and the speaker had the flu, and Ken Klein, who was in charge of the program, constantly communicated with her, and by Wednesday we decided she still wasn't well enough, so a blessing occurred earlier that week. On Monday, I got an email from Dr. Bob Lynch. Connie, if you need a speaker later this month or next, I can help. This was Monday, okay? I can help. I'm reading several articles regarding a very important but underreported topic, but I think would be of value to the class. Microplastics. Should you be concerned about the impact on your health? I've been aware of this issue as it relates to cardiovascular disease, but new information shows accumulation in the brain at much higher levels in patients with Alzheimer's. All in all, there's a cause for concern. Bob. And by Wednesday at 10 a.m., I called him and said, would you speak this Sunday? And he said immediately, yes. And then he was acting like he was sick last night when I saw him out at dinner just to mess with me. But he didn't make a run for it. So one of our favorite speakers is here today, Dr. Bob Lynch.
Anyway, here we are. So better to be thought a fool than to open my mouth and give a talk and erase all doubts that that's the case. So why am I doing this topic? I think it's important for everybody to be aware of this issue. I am not anti-plastics. Plastics have served an enormous role in our society and in the world. A lot of role in medicine, for sure. I mean, you think of all of the syringes and IV bags and IV tubing, cataracts, heart valves, etc., all involved with plastics. Plastics have done an enormous amount of good since they first became aware of plastics in about 1800, but it wasn't until the 1950s that plastic production really started to escalate to where it is today. So a lot of benefits. Plastics are low weight, pliable, moldable, easily sterilized, and in lots of products of health, as I've mentioned, and a lot of products that we consume for sure. So there are a lot of benefits of plastics. The however is that there are health threats related to microplastics, related to nanoplastics. And these health risks, health threats are underreported, under-discussed. Most people aren't really aware of them. And therefore, I think we need to become aware of them. So this talk is designed to outline what we know now as far as health effects and what needs to be done going forward. So one comment, you can't see this background here. That actually is an office building that was in downtown Tulsa in 1897. And it was titled the Robert E. Lynch Building. And so what's interesting about that is my granddaughter asked me if that's where I had my office. And I said, well, I'm old, but I'm not that old. So it was sort of, Betsy actually found that. So with all that in mind, I think that if you can imagine drinking a glass of water, eating seafood, or simply breathing, unknowingly consuming these tiny plastic articles. They are called microplastics, and they have worked their way into our environment, into our food, and now into our bodies. So what does this mean for our health? So we'll explore that. So what are they? What are microplastics? And so they're tiny particles of plastics that range from 1 nanometer, which, to put it in perspective, is 1/80,000th of the width of a hair strand. Incredibly small, invisible, obviously. They go up in size to a maximum of about 5 millimeters. Again, in perspective, that would be like an eraser on the end of a pencil, and that's the largest of a microplastic. Nanoplastics are even smaller. There are two different types. Primary, such that are produced, such as microbeads that are in cosmetics, synthetic fibers in our clothing and towels, and etc. And secondary, broken down from larger plastic waste. So this is a source of microplastics. As you can see on the vertical scale is the leakage that occurs from these particular objects. Macroplastics are huge, as you can see: paint, synthetic textiles, tires, plastic pellets, personal care products. So a lot of sources of plastics without a doubt. So we'll get to this here in a minute. So basically, that's what they are, the sources as I've identified there. So how do these microplastics get into our bodies? Three separate ways. One is through ingestion. Recent studies have found that microplastics are present in bottled water, which I'm going to talk about in greater detail, table salt, honey, even fruits and vegetables, fish for sure, and we'll talk about that. Present whenever plastic packaged foods are ingested. That's route number one, is ingestion. Number two is through inhalation. These microparticles of plastic get caught up outdoors in the wind, get transported in an airborne fashion, and that's the other mechanism. The third mechanism is how these microplastics enter our body is actually through contact, skin contact. A lot of those are through personal care products and through cosmetics. So plastics have enabled extraordinary advances, as I said, in virtually every area of medicine, and they made our lives immeasurably more convenient. However, there's multiple lines of evidence now that indicate that these plastics are neither as safe as was thought, nor as inexpensive as thought. What are plastics? Well, they're basically manufactured chemicals that come from hydrocarbons of gas and oil and coal. And these are the main feedstocks of plastics. ExxonMobil is one of the biggest producers of plastics. Plastics comprise a matrix of what are called polymers of thousands of chemical additives, which is part of the problem, that impart color, impart stability, flexibility, resistance, and water repellency to the plastics. However, many of these additives are toxic. They include carcinogens, neurotoxins, endocrine disruptors, disrupt all kinds of metabolism, lipid metabolism, and therefore increase the risk of diabetes, increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, and increase the risk of stroke. And I'll talk more about the evidence behind that. There have been exponential increases in production of plastics throughout the last several years, which is the main cause of the harms being identified and becoming more concerning. Worldwide, the output of plastics has grown from less than 2 million tons in 1950 to currently 400 million tons per year last year. Well, what's interesting about that is this is projected to double by 2040 and to triple by 2060 as producers increase their output. Disposable, single-use items account for about 40% of current production and contribute disproportionately to the accumulation of plastic waste. Plastic waste is ubiquitous in our environment, where it breaks down into chemical-laden microplastic and nanoplastic particles. So polyethylene, polyvinyl chloride in their various forms are used in a variety of applications, as I'm sure you're aware. The production of food containers, cosmetics, water pipes, drinking water, bottled water, a large range of foods, inhalable particulate matter transported by wind. So it's interesting, real interesting, in some recent report that came out. So there were researchers that evaluated the top 3 brands of bottled water. And these researchers use a very, very specialized imaging type of technique that had not been used before and involved the use of lasers and specialized light sources and so on. And so they were able to determine that on average, each one of these bottles contained 240,000 particles of plastics. The range was from about 110,000 all the way up to 370,000. 1 liter of water is about 4 cups of water. So it's a phenomenal number of microplastics and nanoplastics that are present in bottled water. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. According to, these particles were about 90% nanoplastics, and it was determined that this measurement was anywhere from 10 to 100 times more in terms of quantity than had ever been reported before, based on this new imaging type of technique. There were all 7 types of plastics were involved in this. The water contained also millions of additional particles that did not even match the known plastics that had previously been identified. So it's not yet clear if these unidentified particles are nanoplastics or there are other substances. And so what's interesting about this, these researchers are going to use this technique and apply it to analyze other entities, environmental samples such as tap water, in addition to the bottled water. They're also going to evaluate air samples, indoor and outdoor air samples, and so on. But importantly, they're also developing filters that perhaps can reduce the plastic pollution that occurs from laundry wastewater for sure, since many fabrics contain nylon, which involves plastic and other plastics. Well, amazingly, Americans now purchase up to 15 billion gallons of bottled water every year. Also interesting, I just saw a couple days ago, there's a lawsuit that has just been instituted against Fuji Water Company because Fuji Water advertised themselves as being pristine, pure, and this lawsuit is not attempting to retrieve financial rewards from it. What they want to do is to force the Fuji company to identify that, to label that as to the fact that it's not pure, that there are these microplastics that are present. So we'll see what happens there. So it's kind of interesting to know that no matter what, you can't get rid of the microplastics that are present, for instance, in bottled water, because they're already in place in the bottle. By the time they're produced, transported, and sold, they cannot be removed. The longer that water remains in contact with the plastic, the greater the number of microplastics are present. External factors such as temperature can also influence the quantity of plastic particles present in bottled water. Water from in a plastic bottle that's been sitting in a car, for instance, on a hot day will have a lot more of these microplastic particles than a bottle that is residing at room temperature, not exposed to light. Bottled water is a major source and a major concern. Pouring the bottled water or the water into another bottle will not help. Boiling it will not help. All that does is get rid of bacteria, not microplastics. And very few filters can actually remove nanoplastics. I'm going to show you just an example, if I get to it here in a minute. So that's just a cartoon that shows what I'm talking about here in terms of microplastics that are present within the water bottle. So ever since, I think it was 2018, Austrian scientists began looking for them in human beings. And determined that microplastics are present in almost every organ of the body, clearly identified in blood, lungs, kidneys, liver, heart, and we'll talk about the brain. Recent data showing that. It's also been detected in the placenta and breast milk. Let's see here. So this is just shows that it's almost, don't worry about the numbers below that, just identify that microplastics have been identified in almost every organ of the body. So, as often the case with new health hazards, the health risks of plastics were first determined in workers. There were early warnings that consisted of, in Kentucky, there was a big cluster of what's called hepatic angiosarcomas. These are malignant tumors of the liver in workers in Kentucky who had occupational exposure to polyvinyl chlorides, the polymerization of that. It's also been clusters of our population that has developed interstitial lung disease. Again, was identified in Rhode Island. These workers, textile workers, were exposed to nylon, which is a source of the microplastics. There has been documented increased rates of premature birth, low birth rate, asthma, and pediatric cancers in what are called fence line communities that have been near fracking sites and have been near plastic production sites, saying that, you know, it's not only the workers, but it's the other individuals, and somewhat disproportionately in low income type of individuals. So there's data that came from what's called the National Biomonitoring Surveys of the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Their report suggests that plastic additive chemicals are present in the bodies of nearly all Americans. There is another commission called the Monaco Commission, which is made up of scientists and other individuals, and they concluded that plastics endanger human health at every stage of the plastic life cycle. So the thing that's of interest to me, or has been, is microplastics are progressively being identified as a potential cardiovascular risk factor. And so there was a landmark study that was recently reported. In fact, it was reported January, March of last year. This was a study that involved analyzing plaques that were removed, resected during what's called a carotid endarterectomy. In other words, these are plaques that are within the carotid artery system. These patients were asymptomatic. There's about 270 patients. They were asymptomatic, had no symptoms, but had severe high-grade areas of blockage by plaques. And so they excised those plaques and found that about 170 out of that number, 58.8%, had presence of microplastics identified. So that's issue. The important issue about that is those individuals were then followed for 3 years. And what the researchers did was to evaluate the occurrence of a heart attack, the occurrence of a stroke, or the risk of dying. And lo and behold, it was determined that those individuals that had microplastics within the plaque had 4.5 times the risk of of experiencing either one of those three things, indicating, as compared to plaques from individuals that had no microplastics within them. So there's some association there. You know, association, correlation is not causation. So we have to keep that in mind, that maybe there were other confounding risk factors that caused these findings. These findings are representative of a very select group of individuals that had no symptoms and were undergoing the carotid surgery, and maybe that's not generalizable to the entire population, but we don't know. Those are just the authors of this particular article were very transparent, very clear about mentioning that. But nonetheless, there was a correlation of microplastics and plaques in carotid arteries and adverse cardiovascular events, including death, going forward over the next 3 years. That's very dramatic in terms of evidence. Also, it was determined that there was a considerable increase in expression of what are called circulating inflammatory markers. As you, I'm sure, are aware, inflammation is part of many disease processes, particularly cardiovascular disease processes, cancer, but other disease processes as well. So again, production of a substance, inflammatory agents that are responsible for disease. So it's difficult, as I said, to generalize this, but it's important, I think, to know that further exploration would be helpful. This is a place where there can be, should be a prospective observational study involving enrolling healthy volunteers, testing their levels of microplastics and nanoplastics, and observing for future cardiovascular events. Only time will tell. There will be a sign-up sheet over here, if anybody's interested. So, we'll give it to Tammy. Tammy will have a sign-up sheet. So, the other concerns now about microplastics is they've become elevated to the brain. There's a worrisome new report on brain accumulation of microplastics, increasing over the time assessed with much higher levels in individuals that have dementia, including Alzheimer's disease. Before I go further, this is an example of microplastics within the body. On the left is kidneys. This is, through the imaging techniques that I've described before, this is a deposit of microplastics, and then it's dispersed throughout the kidney tissue. Again, microplastics in the liver, dense microplastics here, and these are microplastics within the brain. These are linear accumulations of microplastics that have all been identified in human organs. So this is a representative on the vertical scale, has to do with the presence of microplastics. You can see, whoops, sorry. Hello. That these are dementia cases, had enormous number or increase in the amount of microplastics that were determined within the brain. Obviously, these were autopsy studies, but nonetheless, these individuals had been diagnosed with dementia, and the microplastics were analyzed much higher than in normal brains. And so there's some correlation there between the presence of microplastics in the brain and a disease such as Alzheimer's. So the experimental findings indicate, the question is, well, why? How does this happen? Because the brain is generally protected by what's called the brain-blood barrier, and it's not quite clear on exactly how this has occurred. How did they get there? What do they do when they're there? Where do they go? How do they get out? So a lot of questions that occur. There was another interesting study. A researcher, again, I think in Rhode Island, was wanting to see what would happen if they injected microplastics within the circulation of mice, and they analyzed the brain. She and her team were not really expecting a substantial outcome from the study, but lo and behold, within 3 weeks, they determined that there was a marked concentration of microplastics within the brain, but importantly, also these mice started demonstrating demented type of behavior. So that was a rather striking finding as well, giving further evidence so there's concern about the presence of microplastics in the brain. So there's also an effect of microplastics on circulation. This is an example of injection. This is in experimental animals. This is all the circulation to the brain, the orange reddish parts, and you can just see that, and that's a baseline level, normal. And we go all the way over here, and this was after 50 minutes, and you can see that there's less intensity of the color here, which means less circulation, inhibition of circulation, and as circulation gets slowed down, then that leads to the formation of clots. And so that may be an explanation for why there is an increased incidence of stroke that was observed in that study that I mentioned previously regarding the carotid plaque. So another concern is the fact that there's rising rates of cancer, particularly colon cancer, in young individuals, concerning evidence that it's a result of toxic influences, perhaps related to microplastics, concern about that. Nonetheless, all of these things pretty much add fuel to the fire that's burning regarding the health hazards of microplastics. With both of these reports and others, there's just an overwhelming accumulation of evidence of the toxicity of microplastics, compelling data to say that there's stimulates an aggressive inflammatory response that has been consistently documented in multiple organ systems. The plastic crisis has been identified in the literature, and it's growing and growing insidiously, and nothing's being done for the most part at this point in time. So how do we manage this? How do we reduce exposure? Well, there's a lot of questions and urgent questions. The question is, should microplastics be considered a cardiovascular risk factor? Should they be considered a neurologic risk factor? What other organs, in addition to the heart and brain, may be at risk? How can we reduce exposure? The current patterns of production, use, disposal are clearly not sustainable. And so the question is, well, what can physicians do? What can other healthcare personnel do? And what can the citizens do? I'm asking these questions because they're being asked. There's no definite answers. There are a few, and we'll talk about those. Microplastics are impossible to avoid. However, it's possible to reduce exposure to them. Certainly avoiding food and drinks that are packaged in plastics is one way. Using less synthetic fabric is another way. Cleaning up household dust, another way. Important to know that heating plastics containers leaches a lot of these microplastics, so avoiding microwaved ready meals is important. Plastic kettles is important. So it can minimize our exposure. You can switch to glass, switch to stainless steel, switch to aluminum instead of storing food in plastic Tupperware or drinking from plastic bottles. Here's, you wonder why we have this up here. This is Connie's, but it's an example of a non-plastic container for water. You don't have to get them with all the spiny projections. That's Connie likes that, but no, none of us.
That's a glass bottle.
So, how about filters? Well, filters, as I mentioned, don't work very well. Charcoal filters, possibly. There's other more expensive options, what are called reverse osmosis filters, and those may be of some value, but it's not clear. Using reusable items, important. Ditching plastic bags, straws. We have the straw Nazi. I know Linda McDaniel is the straw Nazi. She will not accept those when offered at a restaurant. Utensils, other single-use plastics. You can carry reusable plastic bags. Avoid plastic produce bags. Avoid using plastic utensils and straws whenever possible. Obviously, avoiding microwaving and plastic. There are some creative solutions that are being worked on. There's a report of using a polymer to prevent the marine microplastics formation. Also another report using a sustainable and environmentally adaptable absorbent of microplastics. So these, in addition to drastic cutting of plastic production and our reliance on plastic products every day, think plastic water bottles is an example. The marine element is interesting. There's about anywhere from 8 to 10 million tons of plastic in the oceans, and obviously fish ingest some of that, and therefore comes to us, and we ingest that. Well, that's something that needs to be addressed in terms of the amount of plastics present in the oceans, disposable plastics. So we have to say this, and I'm going to end it now, and maybe we'll have some discussion or questions and so on, or maybe not if we're lucky. Microplastics have silently infiltrated our lives, as I've pointed out. This invisible threat, I think, is real. And while the full health effects are not determined, still being investigated, still being evaluated, I think this early evidence that I've discussed with reference to the cardiovascular events and the brain consequences, I think that those very clearly show that this is an extremely serious issue. And unless there is some type of intervention going forward, these harms are projected to get much worse. So we need to reduce plastic consumption, use. We need to make informed choices, for sure. And we need to, I think, particularly healthcare individuals need to evaluate or advocate for a change in crucial steps in terms of protecting our health. It's important for, I think, ethically and morally for our future generations, for us to be aware of this issue and discuss this issue and be cognizant of it. And when there's opportunities to make a statement about this, then they should be taken. So with that, I'll stop and be happy to answer any questions. I know it's a little bit early, but keep in mind I only had 4 days to prepare this, and so you get the shortened version. Well, Mark, what do you have?
I was a young chem major in the 70s, and our organic professor told us about the miraculous discovery of Teflon. And it was done by one of his associates at Stanford, but he said that, this was just this amazing non-stick, non-reactive substance, and that started becoming the lining for every, pot and pan. And now I think has been realized that this could probably contribute to also to these microplastics. Yeah. So is it a difference in the types of the microplastics as far as our physiological response to it that you've seen in your research?
I'm sorry. So you're asking?
Yeah, like in particular Teflon type, the PFAS type of plastics.
Yeah, I did not see a study specifically focused on Teflon per se, but I'm sure that would be included. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't. Anyway, so not a great answer, but that's all I know. Yes?
Dr. Lynch, can you hear me? Are there any studies you are aware of that might have thrombolytic type meds that might break these up in the circulatory system like we do on CVAs and TIAs?
No, not really. I mean, the studies that I showed regarding cardiovascular issues, those are incredibly recent, as I mentioned, like from last year, and some of the reports just came out. The one about the brain just came out. So the answer is no. I don't think there have been any actual studies done about that so far. Yeah.
So,
Mark, yeah.
You may have addressed this. I had to step out earlier probably because of PFAS or probably because of microplastics that I had to get rid of. But anyway, it is PFAS that I was asking about, and that's been in the news a lot for the last number of years. And is PFAS a microplastic? thing, and this may be relate to the Teflon thing.
Yeah, I'm probably not totally qualified to answer that for sure. I don't know for sure, Mark. I mean, good question. You did miss a lot when you went out with your microplastic talk. But I'll stay after class, and I'll tell you about that. Yeah, where was one? Betty. Where's Betty go? Where's she?
Linda wanted to talk about straws. Linda had
Okay, Bob, this is something to kind of look forward to. I saw something on PBS or BBC or somewhere, and so I looked it up while you were talking about this. Bacteria and an enzyme, which I guess are related, they have found that it will eat the plastic and devour it. Have you heard anything about that?
No, but we've been missing some Tupperware, and I sort of wonder. I don't know. I don't know why I say these
I'll
things.
send you.
But thank you. That's an important issue, and the answer is no.
There's a researcher at University of California that, and then there's information on Forbes and BBC and some of that.
So I wonder what happens to those bacteria then. It's. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of things in terms of researching how to deal with this issue for sure. But I mean, obviously, reducing the plastic production and particularly things that develop microplastics and avoiding exposure to those is important to do.
We live at Montereau, and this is a subject that is near and dear to us because we're very, very involved in the development of Alzheimer's and want to connect ourselves to anything that helps that. But what I have done in getting involved in recycling, I've kind of found out that some of the formulations of plastic are better than others. And you can kind of tell that when you look at a recyclable item. If it has a 1 or a 2 or a 5 or a 6, some of those are not recyclable, and we need to be aware. One I would point out is number 6. Number 6 is styrene plastic or styrofoam. And we talked about, you mentioned about heat and something that contains microplastics. Mm-hmm. That would be one to avoid. So kind of look at your numbers, and those will help you. The only other point I would make is be aware if there's anything you can do to elevate the awareness. That's a good thing. Your congressman, anything that gets awareness to this problem.
Yeah.
Number 1 the best then? If number 6,
Number 1 is at Montereau. Number 1 is recyclable. Number 2 and number 5. Those are the only 3.
Yeah. Dave, thank you. Actually, Dave's going to be here next week giving the talk on all this. So a comment about Alzheimer's that I think is related to all this in terms of, I showed you the slide where microplastics interfered with affected circulation to the brain. Some of the new thoughts about Alzheimer's is that it is perhaps a circulation problem, an underlying developing issue of delivering energy to the brain cells. And obviously, if there is impairment in the circulation, a slowdown in the circulation, as I showed, then perhaps there is some connection there. Well, point being, this is an area of new investigation that's occurring. You know, there's been so much focus on the amyloid plaques in brains of people with Alzheimer's, and the management and the treatment of that has not been really very effective, despite multiple studies in several years. And so there is an important issue of circulation and Alzheimer's and perhaps microplastics. Yes.
Yes, and he's already,
the straw Nazi, yes.
He's already mentioned me with straws.
Yes.
And there's a lot of ways we can do that. We can ask for paper there's a lot of grocery stores that you have a choice to use whether you can say, please use paper bag. So Brahms has them both. There are other places that you can ask for it, and then you can use that. That's a big way to do it.
Right, thank you. Great. Any other questions? Oh, yes. No. Well, time's almost up.
I like to study health and nutrition and dandelion, tea, root, the capsules, however you want to take it. It's shown to be clear. It clears out your lungs. Okay, so it helps to get rid of these toxins.
Okay.
And there's other things, if people will research into natural, holistic medicines that God gave us, because God said, everything I made is good, but not everything is beneficial. He gives us, let food be thy medicine and medicine thy food. It's fascinating how what He has created can help detoxify what man is created.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for the comment. Very true. I mean, obviously, we're in a situation where something has to change, for sure. Yes.
Well, I just wanted to share that Jim Bolin, who's a member of our class, used to manage the glass plant in Sapulpa. And in a conversation with him one time, obviously plastics are their competitor, and he made me aware of the fact of two things. One was the fact that the recycle signia that's on the bottom of a lot of products are really not recyclable. And it's due to the big-time lobby of the plastics people in Congress that they spend millions of dollars, Exxon being number one, they spend millions of dollars to keep that on the bottom of things that we think are recyclable, and they're not. So it's kind of ties in with what your comment was about, the numbers. And then number two was, he made me aware of something that I use all the time in my kitchen, and it's the plastic cutting boards. I use those little plastic cutting boards to cut an orange, or big ones to carve a chicken or a turkey or whatever. And you can actually see on those the roughness of where little pieces are broken off. And he made me very aware of that. And they, stainless steel ones, aluminum ones, they do make some substitutes. But I bet that's in most of our kitchens. It was in mine for sure. So.
Right.
Other questions? Yeah. You want to be the last one, okay?
A good first start would be for Walmart to offer that choice of paper or plastic.
Yeah.
Have any paper that I know of.
Oh, they're it's all plastic.
World's largest store.
You just have to take your reusable. That's right.
There you go. There you go. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I would take that. I have a quick question.
All right.
Did you say cosmetics?
I did.
Oh, no.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I know.
Is that just in the product, not what they're packaged in?
It's in the product. Yeah. Yeah.
Does it come from the packaging that it's in, or actually?
Oh, I don't know where it comes from. I just know that it's been identified as personal products, cosmetics. That's in multiple articles for sure. So there's an answer. There's a good answer directly in the product. In the preparation of the product. Well, I think I mentioned that the producing the microbeads of plastics that go into the cosmetics, and so it's introduced in from the manufacturing of cosmetics. So, yep.
Another scary thought, if you look at a subdivision being developed, all the gas lines are plastic lines, and all the water lines, most of the water lines are as well. So.
I know. Well, unfortunately, I've added something else to worry about. So now you not only worry about cholesterol levels, now you have to worry about microplastic levels.
So my question is, if all of us heard what Bob was talking about, and again, we have to be so grateful that someone cares about us so much that he reads a couple of articles and takes it to heart and researches the heck out of it and shares with us what he's learned, but to be proactive and supportive of Bob's effort, let's see if maybe this week we could think before we ask for a plastic bag or take a plastic straw, or go get something at Sonic that's coming in styrofoam. You know, it's really going to be a hard week, but I think that would be a payback for Bob's efforts to educate us on the bad things that are in our things we're eating and drinking. Thank you, Dr. Lynch.
Okay, thank you, Connie.